Welcome to the deep dive. We're going deep today into something that, well, feels kind of basic at first glance. Like we use it all the time, every time we talk, every time we listen.
Yeah, just another day at the word factory.
Right. But if you've spent any time thinking about, like, the philosophy of language, you know things are never quite as simple as they seem. So today we're tackling default meaning, that instant understanding we get from language, that click. We're going deep, deep, deep. Especially if you're someone who, you think about how we even understand anything at all. This one's for you.
Because let me tell you, that automatic understanding we have, it is way more complex than just looking up a definition.
It really is.
Yeah.
And for this deep dive, we've got a pretty hefty guide. We're looking at the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy entry on defaults in semantics and pragmatics.
Oh yeah, that's the big one. Really thorough, covers tons of different angles on what this default meaning thing actually is. A lot to unpack there.
It does.
Hmm.
So our mission today is to unpack it, to figure out the different ways default is used when we talk about meaning. Why is this such a hot topic?
Yeah.
Because it gets right to the core of how we understand each other so quickly. That first leap we take to get what someone's saying. So let's start there. What's our gut feeling about default meaning? What's the common sense take?
Okay, so at its heart, a default meaning is the one that pops out. The meaning that's, well, it's either what the speaker meant to say or at least what the listener thinks they meant to say. And the key here is we usually grab this meaning without, consciously thinking about it step by step, without mentally doing a whole proof about what the speaker is thinking.
It just clicks.
Exactly. But like you said, even that seemingly basic idea, that click, it hides a lot of complexity.
It really does. And that brings us to what our source calls the delimitation debate. Defining default is, it's tied up with these arguments about the line between what's said outright and what's just implied, the said and the unsaid. What are the main camps in this debate?
Well, this is where it gets interesting, especially if you're into the philosophy of it all. There's a fundamental disagreement about where that line is, even if there is one. Some folks are all about context-independent defaults. Think generalized conversational implicatures, GCIs, those things that pop up no matter what the specific conversation is. Classic example, some of the students passed. You hear that, you usually think, okay, not all of them passed. Some folks think that not all inference is just built into the word some. Then you have the folks who say defaults are automatic, but they depend totally on the situation. What makes sense right there in that conversation? And then you got the skeptics.
The skeptics, always got to have those.
Right. They say, forget defaults. All meaning is built on the fly. We're always using context to figure things out, even if we do it super fast. No shortcuts.
So it's not just what the default meaning is, it's how we even get any meaning at all. That ties into all sorts of big questions about how we understand anything. All right, so our source then gets into these properties people give to default meanings. But it also says, even these properties, they're up for debate. Let's take cancelability or defeasibility. Can you easily override a default meaning with more info, with more context?
Oh, that's a big one, a big dividing line, especially for folks who think defaults are super strong, super important to how we communicate. People who love their GCIs will say, sure, you can cancel them, no problem, no contradiction. You can say, some of the students passed, in fact, all of them did. Boom, the not all is gone, doesn't break logic. But then others say, hold on, if it's really a default meaning, why it's so easy to get rid of? Maybe what's getting canceled isn't the actual default, but some weaker thing you inferred. It all comes down to how deeply do we buy into that initial understanding? Is it just a whisper, or is it more like a pillar holding the whole thing up?
That's really interesting, how strong that initial thought is. It's how do we change our minds when we learn something new? Huge for philosophy of mind. Okay, what about automaticity? The idea that default meanings, we just get them no conscious effort. How's that a point of debate?
This is where we get into the nuts and bolts of how our brains understand language. Big questions for philosophers of mind. If meaning comes by default, it's there's a level of processing that doesn't need us to grind away. We're not deducing, we're not weighing pros and cons. It's boom, the word, the situation triggers the meaning, like a reflex. But then you have the folks who say, nope, even the fastest understanding, it's still based on context. It's inference, just super fast, below the radar. So where does automatic end and subconscious thinking begin?
It's how much of our thinking is thinking, Now, another thing is processing time. You'd think if it's automatic, it's got to be fast. But our source mentions experiments where sometimes that's not true. What does that mean?
This is where philosophy meets the lab, which is always cool. The early idea was default meanings are right there, so they're fast. But studies on things like scalar implicatures, that not all, from some, sometimes they show that the fancier meaning, the one with the implicature, it takes the brain longer to process than the plain literal meaning. So some folks are saying, wait, are these implicatures really defaults then? Like maybe even common inferences take a bit of brain power, more than we thought.
That's so counterintuitive, right? Like, it makes you question the whole default means fast thing. Okay, last property here is locality. Do default meanings come from single words, even before we have the whole sentence? Or do we need the whole sentence, the whole proposition? What are some examples?
Sure, so back to our friend, the scalar implicature. A local view would say the word many right there, boom, triggers not all instantly. But a global view says, no, you need the whole sentence. Like, many people enjoyed the lecture, only then do you get the not all inference. Same with like those word combos, collocations like happer cup. A local view might say paper, boom, you're thinking about a cup made of paper. The debate is, are these local defaults just like built into the language, in the grammar, the words themselves? Or are they something we figure out later when we're building the meaning of the whole thing?
So it's like, how small are the pieces of meaning? Are we always making tiny inferences, even at the word level? Or do we need the whole picture?
That sets us up nicely for the different theories about defaults that our source lays out. Let's start with Kent Bach, his idea of implicitures and default reasoning. Right, so Bach, he's all about this idea that we're constantly like jumping to conclusions, but unconsciously. We don't always have to slowly figure out what a sentence means. We just grab the most obvious, the easiest, the most unchallenged meaning. And he calls these enriched meanings implicitures. They're in what's said, implied by it, but they're not like classic Gratian implicatures. And they're not just what's literally said. It's like we take the basic meaning and we flesh it out, we fill in gaps, and boom, we have a full-fledged, contextually relevant thought. The big takeaway for philosophers here is our minds aren't just passively receiving info, they're actively making the meaning, filling in blanks like mental autocomplete.
So for Bach, these default meanings, they're not like a separate layer of meaning we calculate after the literal stuff. They're part of how we even get to the intended message. It's like our minds have these preloaded extra bits of meaning that we just slap on. Okay, next up we have Levinson. Stephen Levinson and his big idea of presumptive meanings, those GCIs. How does he compare to Bach?
Levinson is also big on defaults, but he calls them presumptive meanings, and he puts them under the umbrella of implicatures. He takes Grice's generalized conversational implicatures and refines them, expands them. For Levinson, these GCIs, they sit between the hard rules of semantics and the free-for-all of context-dependent pragmatics. He says they come from how we rationally communicate. We have these heuristics, like the Q principle, say as much as you can. The I principle, don't say more than you need to. And the M principle, unusual ways of saying things mean unusual situations. But unlike Grice, where GCIs are what the speaker meant, Levinson says these presumptive meanings are more about the listener. They're the inferences we make automatically based on these communication rules. And importantly, they can be canceled if the context tells us otherwise. So if Bach is saying our minds jump to conclusions based on patterns, Levinson is saying we have these built-in communication rules that make us assume things automatically.
So Bach is more about how our minds work, and Levinson is more about the rules of the game, the rules of communication. Okay, now the source goes into how computational linguistics handles defaults. First up, SDRT. Segmented discourse representation theory. Sounds pretty technical. What's the deal with defaults there?
Yeah, SDRT is all about making things formal, computational. They see defaults as the most probable paths for understanding how sentences in a conversation connect to each other. The idea is good conversations. They follow patterns, right? And these patterns are described by rhetorical structure rules. These rules tell you how sentences should connect. Like, if you have two sentences about events, you usually assume they happen in the order they're said. That's the narration relation. But if the second sentence is describing a state, it's probably giving you background for the first event. These relations, they're like strong probabilities, and the inferences we make from them, they can be overridden if the rest of the conversation says otherwise. What's cool about SDRT is they don't really care about what the speaker was thinking. It's more about the logic of the conversation itself, how it flows, that determines the default meaning.
So SDRT, they're looking at the glue that holds the conversation together, not the speaker's mind. That's a shift. Next, we have optimality theory pragmatics. How does that model work?
Optimality theory, OT pragmatics, it's also computational, but it's more about intentions, building on those post-Gratian theories. They say that we figure out what an utterance means by weighing these constraints, these competing pressures. And these constraints, they're ranked like a hierarchy. Some are stronger than others. They push us towards the best interpretation, the one that fits best. For example, we might have a constraint that says, go for the interpretation that gives you the most information, or go for the interpretation that makes the most sense in this context. And these constraints can be violated, but the way they interact, the way they're ranked, it leads us to a preferred interpretation, the default. What's interesting here is these defaults, they're not just like suggestions you can easily ignore. They're more like how the interpretation actually happens, kind of like the defaults in default semantics, where the first meaning you get has more weight.
So OT pragmatics, it's like
Yeah.
a system with rules and rankings to figure out the best, the most likely interpretation. It blends the speaker's intentions with how well things fit the context. Now we have defaults in truth-conditional pragmatics. Sounds like that has a lot to do with what we think the meaning of a sentence actually is.
Exactly. Truth conditional pragmatics, it kind of blurs the line between semantics and pragmatics. It says that the way we use language, pragmatics, it can directly affect what a sentence means. It's truth conditions. And these pragmatic processes, they can happen automatically below the level of conscious thought. So these automatic enrichments, like filling in missing information or adding in implied stuff, they create a default interpretation that's like the main meaning, the meaning we use to decide if the sentence is true or false. So here, the default isn't some extra layer, it's baked into the core of what we understand.
So what we understand automatically, even if it's more than the literal words, that's what matters for whether the sentence is true or not. Okay, finally we get to defaults and default semantics. Big name, sounds like defaults are, well, pretty important here.
You could say that. Default semantics, it's a big picture view of meaning. It says that the meaning of what you say, it comes from 5 different sources. The words themselves, how they're put together, the specific situation you're in, how our brains are wired to make inferences, the social and cultural norms, and just like general knowledge about the world. And all these sources, they're equally important. They can all influence the default meaning, and they can even override each other. In this view, you have 2 main types of default meanings. You have cognitive defaults, which are triggered by how our brains work, and social, cultural, and world knowledge defaults. These defaults, they're automatic, and they can even be more important than the literal structure of the sentence. Like, if you hear a baby crying, you automatically think of someone taking care of them, usually the mother. That's world knowledge creating a default.
So it's a much broader view of defaults. It's not just about the words, it's about how we think, what we know, what our culture's like. Now, the source gets into some really important distinctions. Defaults versus salience versus literalness. These are words you hear all the time when people talk about meaning, so it's good to be clear about how they relate, how they're different.
Yeah, for sure. So first, default versus salient. Jora, she says that salience is all about how easily you remember something, how often you use it, how familiar it is. So a meaning can be super salient, even if it's not literal. But defaultness, she says that's more automatic, maybe even independent of context. She thinks default meanings will always win, even if they're not the most salient in that situation. But then you have folks like Jazz Salt who say that default actually depends on salience. The most salient meanings, they're the ones we access automatically. This view, it's called salience-based contextualism. It says that language, since it's both a social thing and a cognitive thing, it primes us to automatically think of certain meanings in certain contexts. So is understanding based on what we easily remember or what's triggered instantly. It changes how we think about the foundation of understanding.
So for Jora, salience is about memory, and default is more immediate. But for Jazzolts, salience is the key to unlocking those automatic meanings in a specific context. That's a big difference. What about defaultness and literalness? How do those relate?
That's where things get really interesting for philosophers of language, especially with all these new theories about how context shapes meaning. If default is often tied to salience, and salience isn't always about literal meaning, then the whole literal versus non-literal thing starts to break down. Take the sentence, "The city is asleep." We don't actually think the buildings are literally sleeping. We understand it means the people are quiet, inactive. That's the salient meaning, the default. Some theories even say that meaning itself is built on the fly, with words changing their meanings to fit the context. So there's no fixed, literal meaning anymore. Instead, words have these probabilistic meanings, where different senses have different chances of being activated, depending on the context.
So instead of a fixed literal meaning that we then move away from to get metaphors or implications, meaning is shaped by context from the beginning. and defaults come from what's most salient, what fits best. Which brings us to the idea of meaning being built together, co-constructed, and the idea of dynamic defaults. How do defaults change when we think about conversations not just as, like, information exchange, but as something we do together?
This is a newer way of thinking about pragmatics, where the focus is on how we actively negotiate meaning, how we build it together during a conversation. Defaults aren't static anymore, they're fluid. As we talk, we create shared understanding, we figure out what we both know, we make commitments, and all this leads to interactional defaults. These are meanings that become like unspoken assumptions as the conversation goes on. We don't always have a perfect plan for what we're going to say. We're often figuring it out as we go. And these dynamic defaults, they help us do that.
So meaning isn't just beamed from one head to another. It's built in the space between us, and defaults can emerge and change during the conversation. That has big implications for who's responsible for the meaning, right? Accountability.
Yeah, that's right. This brings in ethics, epistemology, even law. Big questions for philosophers. What should speakers be held accountable for? Just the bare minimum meaning of their words? Or should it include the default interpretations, the things people are expected to understand? This matters for like how we define what it means to say something truthfully, how we think about deception, lying, misleading. Even for analyzing arguments, especially when someone uses a trick where they pretend a general statement is a universal one, ignoring the unspoken qualifications that everyone usually gets by default.
So if you say something that has a clear default meaning in that context, even if your words technically could mean something else, are you responsible for that default meaning? It gets into intent, how the listener understands the shared knowledge between you.
Absolutely. And in these discussions of accountability, the type of default that matters most is the one that's created by the people in the conversation, the meaning they build together, the one they both accept. This dynamic view of meaning, it could really change how we think about responsibility in communication.
This has been a truly fascinating deep dive into default meaning. It's amazing how something that feels so automatic, so effortless, turns out to be so complex, so debated by linguists and
Oh,
philosophers.
no, right. It shows you that this ability to just get what someone means, it's actually built on this intricate system of language, context, brain power, social norms, and the whole idea of default meanings, it's still a mystery in many ways. Still a lot to figure out.
So to our listeners, especially the philosophy fans out there, here's a little something to think about. The last time you understood someone instantly, what kind of default thinking was going on? Was it the words, the context, your shared knowledge, or some mix of all that? And how would a philosopher analyze that moment, that leap from words to understanding? We've only scratched the surface here, and we encourage you to keep exploring. Check out the concepts of implicature, presupposition, and the whole philosophy of language. Thanks for joining us on The Deep Dive.